Thanks, Ollie. I'm extremely happy to be the person who can introduce Katy Hayward. One of the things I think about this conference is we are shining a light, I think, on some of the kind of the best traditions in Irish sociology and sociology that happens in Ireland. I think it's undoubted that one of the key areas that Ireland has contributed, Irish sociology in Ireland has contributed to sociology at large, has been a piece of conflict studies. And Katy Hayward is one of the leading figures in this. I know Katy is extremely busy. Events are moving so quickly, and her work is so important, and it's so necessary that we are extremely grateful that she could join us for this conference. The context, I guess, I don't need to lay it out for people, but it's so important in the year and in the events that have been happening over the last few years. I mean, 2022 is looming, the foundation of the two states on the island of Ireland, the constitutional uncertainty that we are facing on the island. It's really excellent that Katy is with us to shine a light on this for us and kind of share her insights on this with us. To kind of introduce Katy's work, I mean, Katy is an incredibly prolific sociologist. She has produced several books, including What Do We Know and What Should We Know About the Irish Border, The Dynamics of Political Change in Ireland, Northern Ireland, A Generation After the Good Friday Agreements. Many articles, too many articles to mention. Overall, Katy's work focuses on peace and conflict processes, political sociology, political discourse, protest and violence. More specifically, it focuses on Ireland, North and South, on border issues, conflict over borders, cooperation, the impact of EU integration. And then obviously very importantly is Brexit, and importantly listed in inverted commas because of course Brexit is in fact UK exit. It's not simply Brexit. Ireland is very involved there. Katy's work has been recognised very broadly. She is an Eisenhower Fellow. She's a Fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. One of the kind of incredible things about Katy's work is the way it has impacted in many ways. I've mentioned some of her key books, some of her recent key books, but also Katy has huge policy influence. She's fed into policy in a major way. She's been technical expert panel. She's a member of the technical expert panel of the UK government's alternative arrangements advisory group on Brexit. She has spoken to several parliamentary committees. She has produced a range of research reports, which have been very important for delineating the challenges around borders and peace and the constitutional future, North and South. And also, we have to mention that Katy is really the definition of a public sociologist. Katy writes widely in newspapers. I believe she's even won an award for her use of Twitter in terms of spreading good information in the world, which is something that we believe in very much. And saying that, to finish, just extremely happy that Katy's with us to re-emphasize how important our work is right now because of events, because of the oncoming commemorations, the really important ones. So we're really absolutely delighted that she's with us. And without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Katy. Welcome, Katy.
Thank you so much, John. That's such a lovely introduction. And I'm very grateful to you, not just for that, but for the invitation. And I'm grateful to all of you for coming 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning to hear what's going to be quite an expansive presentation because, you know, I think these kind of gatherings and events are really good opportunities to reflect and think about where we are. And I really like the title of your conference, Together Apart. And so I've picked up on that in the theme of my presentation. And, you know, I've been thinking obviously an awful lot about Brexit and about partition and about the protocol and about potential Irish unification. And preparing this presentation has just been a really good opportunity to stand back a wee bit and to reflect. And so, as I say, it's quite expansive because it includes history, geography, politics, as well as sociology. And I make no apology for that. I hope it's of interest, and I hope to finish in good enough time to be able to have a wee bit of opportunity for Q&A. So I have slides, which I will endeavour to share. Oh, sorry. I want to try and get my clock going so I keep an eye on the time. Okay, so I want to begin by thinking about what was made apart by partition. And we've been talking a lot about partition in the North, particularly recently, given that the 3rd of May is seen as the centenary of the creation of Northern Ireland. So this was the island that existed at the time of that the Home Rule Act was drawn, and that was in 1914. And the borders of this particular that are represented here in this pie chart of the census results from 1911. That's the topographical area of the island of Ireland, but of course it's not the borders of the state. Ireland was in the United Kingdom at the time, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And the reason why it's worth considering the notion of the census is, of course, the fact that the census isn't just about classification, but quantification. And then political judgments being made on the basis of those quantities, if you like. And of course, as Anderson so brilliantly explained, and no one's really topped him since, what the key element is in relation to nation state building is aligning the census to the map. And the imagination of the nation in relation to that. And of course, this is the map that was in the mind of those who were considering home rule for the island of Ireland. Decisions in Ireland at the time around governance and around access to power and privilege were made on the grounds of land, and they were made on the grounds of religion, as well as gender, of course, if you're thinking about enfranchisement. So this is the map that's quite significant when it comes to what was going on at the time when the Home Rule Act was drawn. Now, of course, the Home Rule Act was for the home rule of all of the island, but it was suspended at the end of, just before the commencement of the First World War. So it never came into effect. Another consideration in the drawing up of the Home Rule Act was, of course, Westminster elections. So there were 103 seats in Westminster from Ireland. And it's a translation of the religious affiliation to the political affiliation that was really critical here, most particularly towards the late 19th century, the way in which Protestants in the North in particular decided to align themselves most exclusively with unionist parties, so a combination of all of that. And we see here just quite how stark, therefore, the representation is of a different manifestation of political identity and will in the North compared to the rest of Ireland. Just a small note that the different colour of the party down there around Cork is the All Ireland League, which had principles, didn't last terribly long, but it was principles of conference, conciliation and consent in relation to the future of Ireland, which I thought was quite notable, given that we are still very concerned around the issue of consent when it comes to the future of Northern Ireland, which I'll mention towards the end. An amending act had been made, or a bill had been proposed for the Home Rule Act, which would have seen the exclusion of Ulster. And this came about as a result of a coalition between the Unionists and the Conservative Party at the time. However, it wasn't put into effect, but it's worth bearing in mind given what happened later. By the time after the First World War, imagine all of the stuff that happened between the First World War and then 1920, Treaty of Versailles, etc. Lines being drawn across maps in various parts of the world by colonial powers and victorious powers. The Government of Ireland Act, of course, brought in then partition of the island of Ireland. This came about as a result of an amendment being made by the House of Lords to the previous version of the Home Rule Act, and basically allowed for separate unicameral parliaments in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, as it was called. Notably, and I've been really struck by parallels between what happened in 1920, 21 and what's happened in 2020 and 2021. But anyway, there was no support from the MPs of the island of Ireland for the Government of Ireland Act. So Unionists objected to it because they wanted all of Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom. and for the most part, Irish MPs abstained, or in some cases, such as Joe Devlin, the Nationalist MP, they voted against. Anyway, regardless of that, it was approved by a majority, a very large majority in Westminster. Again, there are parallels with 2020. It was approved by a large majority in Westminster, and then, as I say, it came into effect on the 3rd of May, 1921, when the transfer of powers happened. So this is the island. Now, of course, we didn't have a census in 1921 because of the violent situation across the island. But the closest census we had then is 1926, and I've combined these results here. And we'll just notice, like in terms of headline figures, the population has decreased in those 15 years by about 150,000. We don't see a huge shift in the proportion, although the Protestant population has declined relatively to 23%. Of course, that wasn't the map, or that's the image that people had of the situation by 1926. Instead, it was looked at in these terms. So the separate states of the Irish Free State by that time and Northern Ireland. And this is the image that, and the impression that we have of Ireland, North and South, that of course has been sustained and perpetuated for most part of the 20th century. Now, one thing I just want to pick up on is the fact that when partition happened, it wasn't, there was written into that Government of Ireland Act was a means by which basically partition would be overcome. And I don't know if you can read the writing on the bottom of that cartoon, but it's David Lloyd George, and he's saying, "I now proceed to cut this map into 2 parts and place them in the hat. After a suitable interval, they'll be found to have come together of their own accord aside. At least that's what I hope. So I've never done this trick before." And essentially what we saw in the Council of Ireland was that there was a view to establishing overall at the end a parliament for the whole of Ireland. And interestingly, in the article relating to the Council of Ireland in the Government of Ireland Act, it emphasises mutual agreement and uniformity of action on the island of Ireland. So this was the intention, creating an all-Ireland body through which those 2 parliaments could work together. And eventually it was hoped that they would begin to work increasingly on common policies across the piece. However, it didn't happen that way. And this is about the impact that partition has in many respects. So of course, there were elections to what were now the Southern and the Northern Parliaments in June 1921. And we see here the stark representation of the impact of that, of partition, not just in the fact that Sinn Féin returned 124 out of 128 seats, also the fact that they didn't sit in that Southern Parliament, but also the fact in the North we have such a huge proportion of Unionist seats. The Council of Ireland was meant to be made up of members who were nominated from the respective parliaments to it. There were 13 members nominated in June 1921 from the Northern Parliament, all of whom were Unionists. So unsurprisingly, the Council of Ireland never came into effect. It was basically binned along with a report from the Boundary Commission and the Tripartite Boundary Agreement of 1925. This is another, of course, a lot was happening, as John has already mentioned, 1921, 1922. And again, we see more representation of growing difference between North and South in terms of, obviously, well, interestingly, at this time, the number of Northern Ireland seats in Westminster was dramatically cut from 30 to 13. And then in the South, of course, we had the split in Sinn Féin about the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which of course wasn't just about partition, but also about Dominion status under through the Irish Free State. So 12 days after we had the election in the South in 1922, the Civil War began. And I'm not going to talk in any detail about that, except to note that it was just a few years after the Civil War ended when De Valera, who obviously led the anti-treaty side, decided that abstention wouldn't work, formed the Fianna Fáil party, and in 1926 very rapidly came into power, and then of course was behind very much a sort of a leader in the national imagination of Ireland through the main course of the 20th century, not least of which being Run Run Heron. So north-south, what does that look like? Well, it's easy to forget the commonalities between north and south in our focus upon different states. But of course, the two sides had common administrative heritage, similar bureaucratic systems, similar political traditions and cultures. Law, of course, coming from the same foundation. Similar amounts of economic vulnerabilities. Demographically, high levels of emigration, high levels of fertility, very rural and agrarian populations, and of course, religious observance was very high indeed. This is rarely considered and soon came to be forgotten in imaginings of the island of Ireland, including by social scientists. And I'm not going to go on long about this, although I could, because I find it really fascinating. But essentially, without putting too fine a point on it, you can see how social science, obviously it's conceived differently then, but you can see how over time partitionism came into play, be it willful or simply by default in many ways. We have extreme versions of it through Heslinger's sort of notorious book, The Irish Border as a Cultural Divide, in which he said, you know, the surprise was basically that not that Northern Ireland didn't want to join with the South, but the majority of the South didn't want to continue to be part of the UK. I'm putting it very bluntly there, but essentially this idea that there was a long tradition and cultural distinction that existed on the island of Ireland that made the north of it very closely linked already to Britain. And then we have slightly different reflections from Brian Gervin, a political scientist, who's talking about the fact, as he sees it, that there was already a separate nationality, if you like, in Northern Ireland, and that partition just institutionalized something that was already existing. The question arises, of course, of what that separate nationality is. Is it Ulster nationhood? And what does that look like? Or is it Britishness? And this is a question that's continued to dog analyses of the political identities and conflict in Northern Ireland. However, we mustn't overlook the obvious, which is the fact that a border had been drawn, and we don't want to retrospectively justify or explain partition in those terms. We want to be really careful about how we understand and the way that these things come into effect, and also their consequences. And one thing that I would recognize at the stage of my career is just quite how influential those whose work we read and admire, particularly as postgrads, how that continues to be influential. And the work of Liam O'Dowd is definitely that in my case. And even though I think sometimes I've done quite a lot on my own, I owe him a great debt in terms of what I've learned from him, intellectually, apart from anything else. And I think his sociological explanation of basically the trends of imperialism and nationalism and how those work, how they're manifested in the Irish border, has a nuance and a complexity to it that really remains particularly useful when we're trying to understand the processes that happened on the island of Ireland, and of course that continue to have effect here. So the quest, borders circumscribing national sovereignty rather than just manifesting them, the quest to kind of then have a certain homogeneity in the nation and definition of nationhood, that is something that really we can't overlook when it comes to North and South and the growing back-to-back development that occurred over the course of the 20th century. So, sorry, I don't know what's happened to that picture of the front cover of this book here. So 75 years after partition, there was a conference in Nuffield College in Oxford where many eminent sociologists, including members of SAI, came to talk about a comparative analysis of Ireland North and South, and it was really remarkable, and it was the first proper attempt at comparison that had been done, even after all that time. And David Rotman, at the beginning of this, of what became a book, talks about the fact that the application of a comparative perspective, embracing what he calls both Irelands, had never really been encouraged. And if we look at the tradition of social studies and sociology as well, North and South, we can see how and why this occurred. Interestingly, he says that the North was thought of often in the South as a problem of politics and morality. And having reviewed some time back issues of the Irish Journal of Sociology and the way that Northern Ireland has been covered in studies and articles and that, you can see this is in some ways very much the case. Interestingly too, the book refers to Northern Ireland in terms of being very mixed compared to the homogeneity of the South, and those terms we probably wouldn't use nowadays when we're thinking about ethnic diversity in the respective jurisdictions. I'm not going to go in any detail over this, but I think it is interesting just to consider 75 years after partition, quite how significant the differences were then, North and South, and how they reached across several areas. It's not, obviously, it's not just in terms of religion, but essentially what you're seeing in here is the importance of the state. And there are very significant differences, North and South, and they're not just reliant on the different economic bases either, obviously the industrial inheritance of the North in particular. Structural disadvantage in Northern Ireland, I mean, it's quite shocking to know this, or to recognize this, but in 1996, Catholic men were twice as likely to be unemployed as Protestant men. And then we also, of course, have the ongoing violence at the time. So very significant differences between North and South, but also we see notable trends of convergence or commonality, some being more positive than others. So an expanding middle class. There were also trends of rising unemployment at the time in the mid-1990s, growing process of a social exclusion. Positive movements, as Sally Shortall and Pat O'Connor were writing in the book about reducing gender inequalities and also connected to declining fertility rates. Growing rejection of the church's right to speak on matters of morality. And then, of course, last but not least, is common EU membership. And it is notable quite how significant EU directives are on a number of things, and also, of course, EU funding. And this is noted throughout the book. I can't talk about Ireland North and South, of course, without considering the Good Friday Agreement. And one thing just strikes me in this, and we see this image all the time, but it's just the fact that we have signatures here. Obviously, there's Tony Blair's and Bertie Ahern's, but if you're looking at this, we've got obviously Monica McWilliams, Liz O'Donnell, Gusty Spence, and Jerry Adams and Billy Hutchinson, David Irvine. It's quite something to see these names on one particular document, and I think it really is a testament to quite what an achievement it was. I could talk a lot about this, and I'm not going to either, but of course, in many ways, the agreement was a revolution to some degree, and Article 1.2 of the agreement is really significant, talking about the right to self-determination, basically for people on the island of Ireland. So thinking about it as a unit in those terms, but of course that point of consent, and that the consent has to be given North and South. So in that way, recognizing Northern Ireland as an entity, as a unit, is significant. But also the principle of self-determination means that the border could be eradicated in the future, in the case of such a referendum, although of course this does depend on the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland calling it. Also, in many ways, the agreement was a revolution because of what it meant in terms of institutionalizing all Ireland political bodies in cooperation. North-South Ministerial Council, of course, being the most significant one, along with the implementation bodies. It's quite a different arrangement to the Council of Ireland, but it nonetheless is really significant. And we see here Anthony Heath et al. In that book talking about, they're just writing the conclusion just after the agreement had been signed, so talking about possibly leading to new dual senses of identity. And Ian Gregory's work, geography, but also talking about the rift that the border represents may be diminishing over time. Now, I could put many quotes from myself in such a thing, sort of talking about the diminishing significance of the border in light of the Good Friday Agreement and in light of European integration. I'm sparing my blushes, but I have written plenty on that. But again, really important social science contribution, and we're thinking about why it is important to think historically and what's happened in the past, and to think around dynamics of power and particularly how that looks in terms of historical legacy. So the book Renovation or Revolution, edited by John Coakley and Jennifer Todd and Bridget Laffan, made a really good point about the success of those bodies. And I don't think they meant it to be particularly dramatic, but they were saying essentially, if this is to be a revolution in terms of relationships within Ireland and between these islands, then it depends on European integration. And they also say it depends on the legacy of the history and the past imperial type relationship between the two islands. So I had to talk about Brexit, of course. I'm not going to go into any details, but it's possible to say that Brexit has revealed the susceptibility of the former and the tenacity of the latter. In that, contrary to any expectations in the drawing up of the Good Friday Agreement, now Northern Ireland is outside of the European Union. And also what this process has revealed is quite how significant the Britain, and in particular London, Westminster, remains to the future of Ireland and what happens on the island of Ireland. So a century on, where are we? Sorry. So this is, these are the results now. Obviously Northern Ireland has its census every 10 years rather than every 5, so it's not completely parallel. We look forward to the results of the 21 census that's just taken place in the north, and I know the Irish census is next year. But anyway, this is as good as you have for the time being. So we see just quite how different Northern Ireland is compared to when it was created. And there's a lot of speculation about what it will look like in these next census results, i.e. the embedded Catholic minority is no longer a minority. And notably, we see not a huge growth in other religions, but a very significant existence of those who do not have any religion or don't state their religion. I wouldn't, and you'd expect me as a sociologist not to translate across to what that those no religion or those with no religion how they would vote in a referendum, although I'm always asked to speculate on that. But it is very significant that they exist. And of course, that's reflected to some degree in voting patterns in the north. This is not a political act, but if you're looking at this island of Ireland now, in terms of those census results, again, this is the island that we're talking about. And if you look at comparative results between the census here and the census in England and Wales and Scotland, we see there are significant differences with Britain. So the population on the island of Ireland, so both north and south, 21% under the age of 15, and 12% over the age of 65. This is very different to the much older population in Britain. There's much more rural population still on the island of Ireland, so 35% rural compared to around 17% in Britain. And then the Christian population, around, say, 85% on the island of Ireland, compared to around 55 or less % in Britain. So notable differences between the two islands, but there are also significant differences north and south as well. including most notably perhaps in ethnic diversity, whereas the last census said 1.8% of Northern Ireland population being from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, compared to around 16% in the South. A lot has happened, even in the 10 years since those censuses were taken. And again, I'm not going to go in any detail about this, but what we have seen is, in some effects, a drawing of a border, a new border, perhaps half a border or a partial border down the Irish Sea. And I think perhaps the most significant thing to note on this is just what it means for the context for the Good Friday Agreement, the context for that British-Irish relationship now with the UK now outside of the EU, the context for North-South cooperation, and of course, we see this new element of division within Northern Ireland. This is my final slide. So, together or apart, post-Brexit, and post-protocol, I should say, the state regimes that relate to the most significant differences between North and South could become increasingly divergent. So in economic terms, the economies could become more divergent. So there's a fear amongst unionists of a united Ireland by stealth, but the service economy, which is huge for Northern Ireland, it is a service economy, similarly in the South. Services aren't integrated anymore on the island of Ireland because Northern Ireland, the movement of services are governed in the protocol. Also, immigration regimes are going to be very different. Of course, EU workers no longer have automatic right to reside and work in Northern Ireland. The immigration regime here is determined by London. Similarly, political culture and flux. Goodness knows what's happening in the South in that regard. Fascinating things going on, weakening affiliation with political parties, etc. In some ways, there's less flux here, but who knows? Things are changing, and we don't know what effects they may have. We may have an entrenchment, we may have a growing middle ground. A lot depends on what happens even in the next few months. And then in terms of democratic legitimacy, I have a deep worry about the legitimacy of the institutions that have been established to oversee the protocol and these new arrangements, and the undermining of the legitimacy of some of those Good Friday Agreement institutions as well. So there's a real sense of this being a critical moment for Northern Ireland, and therefore for the island as a whole. So what remains key and worth keeping an eye on is, of course, well, you'd expect me to say this, but is official nationalism. So looking ahead, even in the coming years, even at this point of more centenaries, for Irish nationalism, can it be inclusive? Could we see an Irish nationalism that is capable of taking in British identity, which I haven't talked about, but very strong British identity and Northern Irish identity amongst Protestants in Northern Ireland is something that will have to be accommodated in many ways. And then also the big question is, what will post-Brexit nationalism do to Britain? Will there be a union for unionists to aspire to be part of? That dynamic is really fascinating, and there's a huge sense of flux in all of that at the moment. And then just to conclude, unification, prospects for it, desires for it, expectations of it. I mean, it's very much in the air at the moment. And now, for the first time in many, many years, it's a topic of conversation in the South as well as in the North. I would just conclude by saying unification isn't just about removing a border, it would also be about drawing a new one. And we know from the history of the past century that that's a matter of enormous consequence. Thank you.